This is the 8th of June, and from this day in Baptist history, our subject is Anne, the heroine of Ava. Our passage of Scripture is Hebrews chapter 11, verses 37 through 40. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Banners floated in the tropical breeze as if keeping time to the martial music of the military band. British and Burmese officials were seated when, much to the surprise and consternation of the Burmese commissioner, Sir Archibald Campbell re-entered the tent with a lady on his arm. These Burmese should have been alarmed because this lady was known as the Heroine of Ava. It was Adoniram Judson's wife, who had suffered because of their cruelty to her husband and others. Now they were in the presence of the general who had them completely at his mercy, and of the woman who could give testimony to their incivility and cruelty. According to their standards, their day of reckoning had come. One man in particular was suffering greatly. His face was covered with perspiration and was white and distorted with fear. It was to his home that Anne Judson had walked several miles to beseech a favor for her husband, who was bound with 5 fetters in the inner prison and suffering from an intense fever. She had been kept waiting from early morning until noon for her audience and received only a gruff refusal. As she turned to leave, he caught sight of her silk umbrella and seized it to satisfy his own fancy. She pled in vain for a paper substitute to shield her from the brutal tropical sun, only to be mocked by a statement that only fat people were in danger of sunstroke, and that the sun would not be able to find her. This he did because the suffering she had endured had wasted her to a mere shadow. Anne recorded that all this suffering began on June 8, 1822, when, and I quote, "just as we were preparing for dinner, in rushed an officer holding a black book with a dozen Burmans, accompanied by one whom, from his spotted face, we knew to be an executioner and a son of the prison. The spotted man, he instantly seized Mr. Judson, threw him on the floor, and produced the small cord, the instrument of torture. All the pleading of Mrs. Judson was to no avail and resulted only in her also being seized. The scene was shocking beyond description, attracting the entire neighborhood and resulting in the spotted executioner throwing Judson to the ground several times, tightening the cords until he could scarcely breathe. Adoniram was committed to the death prison. Anne returned to her home, which was surrounded by a guard of 10 ruffians who tried to force an entrance into and who spent the night in dreadful carousing and diabolical language. This was the beginning of their suffering many cruelties and indignities. The next morning began the vigil of appealing to the king, governor, and other officials over a period of many months while her husband lay in irons in prison. In response to all this evil, she ministered to Burmese and other foreigners alike. The magistrates extorted large sums of money just to give a bit of relief to the suffering prisoners. One scene describes many. Mr. Judson crawled to the door as the heavy fetters around his ankles prevented his walking. The torture of mind and body that he had endured was stamped upon his face, which was as haggard as if death had already claimed him. His soiled, unkempt condition added to the misery of his appearance. At the sight of him, his wife buried her face in her hands, unable to behold the shocking change that 2 days had wrought. Scarcely had they begun to talk together when the jailers ordered her away. With true womanly fidelity, Anne attended to the needs of the prisoners as far as she was allowed, walking 2 miles to the prison and returning home alone after 9 o'clock at night. Inside the prison, Mr. Judson had his companions suffered persecutions. Often they were forbidden to speak to one another or to communicate with friends outside. They were compelled to pay for food or simple favors. At times, water was forbidden and fresh clothing denied. Always 3 pairs of heavy fetters bound their ankles so closely that a shuffle was the only possible step. Again and again they closed their eyes and ears when some fellow prisoner was tortured with the cord or iron mallet or led forth at the fatal hour of 3 in the afternoon for execution. At night the white prisoners were huddled in a corner, and a bamboo pole was thrust between the chains around their ankles and hoisted to an angle that left only the shoulders resting upon the ground. For days Mrs. Judson was not seen going to the prison or on her usual rounds of mercy among the people. Adoniram knew that the reason for this, a baby girl had come into the lives of these suffering parents. 20 days after the birth of baby Maria, she was carried to the prison to greet her father. Adoniram crawled forth to meet them and for the first time take his child into his arms and look into the blue eyes of his pale daughter. After some time, Adoniram came down with smallpox. He lingered for many days between life and death while his wife ministered to him. She appealed to the governor that she be permitted to build a shelter on the prison grounds. After some time, permission was granted, and Judson was delivered from the terrible disease. During this time, word circulated on several occasions that orders had come for execution. A servant came running with his face pale with fright. "The white prisoners have all been carried away," he gasped. She immediately thought that some order of execution was to be carried out, but soon found that they were being transported to Amrapura. She engaged a crude Burmese cart, which was merely round pieces of wood, with holes in the center through which a pole was passed, and was jostling along through rocks, sand, gravel, and mud on her way to Amrapura. Her journey and that of Adoniram ultimately ended in the heathen village of Ungbinelli, where they were reunited. On the way, she had been stricken with a severe disease and had become so emancipated that when her husband beheld her, he burst into tears. She finally fell victim to the horrible disease, spotted fever. Unable to nurse her baby Maria night after night, Anne was compelled to listen to the wails of her starving, crying child. She finally received permission for Adoniram to carry the baby through the village, begging a few drops from those Burmese mothers who had young children. Ultimately, a Burmese woman came to her door and volunteered her services as nurse for Maria. The sickness ran its violent course, but with the aid of Dr. Price, who had recently been released from prison, she recovered. The limits of this devotional cannot afford room enough to record all of the suffering and persecution this family experienced during the British-Burmese conflict. After the close of the war, they settled in a little house at Amherst. Mr. Judson was urged to accompany the British Civil Commissioner to Ava to negotiate a treaty that would include a clause to ensure religious liberty to the subjects of Burma. Adoniram and Anne embraced and kissed each other as he departed for an absence anticipated to be for only 3 or 4 months. Little did they know that before his return, Anne's body would be buried near the spot where she first landed. On the 6th of October, 1826, her spirit went home to her Lord, and in the spring of 1827, Maria joined her mother at the age of 2 years and 3 months. Her small body was laid by the side of her mother's under the hopia tree, the tree of blessed hope. To God be the glory.